let me introduce Jim Boughton, who will moderate the session. Jim is a senior fellow at CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation in Toronto. He was the fund's historian from 1992 to 2012, writing 2 magnificent volumes on the fund's work. And he brings, I think, a really excellent overall perspective on how the fund has evolved over the years. So let me pass over to you, Jim. Jim, I can't hear you. We seem to have lost Jim. Jimmy, you may want to try turning the video off and just using audio. I don't want to waste too much time. Maybe we should just go straight to the 2 presentations since time is short, and then Jim can catch up with us later, but I think he's having some connection issues. So we have 2 presentations from IEO staff. First by Nicoletta Batini, who looks at the evolution of the fund and what it's implied for the issues that the IEO faces, with some suggestions on what that will look like going forward, new challenges that will emerge. And then we'll hear from Miguel de Las Casas, who has been looking at evaluation work in other partner institutions and what we can learn at the IEO from others' experience. So let's just go straight to Nicoletta, and then hopefully Jim will be back with us as those 2 presentations wrap up. So Nicoletta.
Thank you, Charles. Let me start sharing my screen. Can you see it?
Yep.
Okay, well, my presentation summarizes work by Prakash Lungani, the Assistant Director of the IEO, and myself on the evolution of the IMF's role over time and how the IEO can help the fund face new challenges as well as old ones. So looking at the past 25 years, there have been 2 key developments that shaped the IMF's work, really. First, the IMF had to manage recurrent financial crisis, particularly in the emerging markets over the 1994-2002 period, and then in advanced economies, of course, during the global financial crisis. These crises have not slowed the growth of global income, but they have had large short-term costs, and for individual countries have sometimes implied what people call a lost decade of income, like in the case of Argentina or the case of Greece. Second, while average incomes have been going up in most countries, these happen at different speeds across and within countries. As the IMF understood this more and more, it started to move away from a rigid adherence to the old orthodoxy towards a broader set of policies aimed at greater macrofinancial stabilities and more inclusive growth. So over the past quarter century, there's been both an increase in the demand for the IMF's core work of fostering macrofinancial stability and managing crisis, as well as more attention towards policies for inclusive growth, which has taken the IMF into areas that some people consider outside its core mandate. In the paper, we discuss these developments in more detail and how IEO evaluations have helped the IMF adapt its policies on these two fronts. We look ahead as we think about how the IEO can help the IMF meet the challenges of the next decade. It is useful to reflect on how the IMF's own role will continue to evolve. And it's hard to forecast what events will mark the next decade. For sure, we know that this decade started with a bang, the COVID pandemic. But in fact, each decade of the IMF's existence have been marked both by known challenges and new challenges that were difficult to anticipate. And so it seems quite likely that, like the current pandemic, some of the crises that the fund will have to manage in the future will be mixes of real shocks, especially environmental and perhaps health crisis, and financial crisis of the old kind, with implications for the fund's toolkit and advice. We call these in the paper super crisis by virtue of the multi-shock, global scale, long legacy connotations. We also expect that the distinction between the fund's core and non-core work will become increasingly blurred. We think that work on climate change, for example, will expand considerably, given the growing economic impact of these planet-wide challenges. And indeed, thinking about it, work on climate issues could potentially dominate fund work in the coming decade, given the wide-ranging economic implications of energy and food system transitions necessary to stabilize the Earth system during this decade and beyond. Likewise, we expect work on inclusive growth to be scaled up and become more deeply entrenched in IMF policy advice and lending activity. This trend will be reinforced because both the current pandemic and climate change have a strong regressive impact on low-income and vulnerable countries, as well as for low-income sections of the population within countries. If you think about it, low-income and developing countries are the countries that most need the IMF's help to achieve sustained and inclusive growth, but where the IMF was able to provide the least financial support, at least in GDP terms, during the pandemic. Looking ahead, these are the countries most likely to be adversely impacted by climate change and least able to cope. And the growing outlet of mass migration has enormous spillovers on advanced economies, possibly through the anti-immigrant backlash and the rise of populism. Now, reflecting this trend, the fund will need to expand its resources dedicated to its non-core areas outside its core expertise in macroeconomic policies. It would also need to become less self-reliant and more committed to working closely with partners with much greater depth and expertise in areas such as climate and quality. We think that IEO can play a key role helping the fund strengthen its capacity to manage oncoming challenges. But the IEO must also be ready to adapt and innovate. In particular, we suggest a number of possible shifts in the IEO strategy and focus, and both on topics to the left of this slide for evaluation, and the instruments and resources we use, which are listed on the right of this slide. On topics for evaluation, clearly the IEO will have to evaluate more frequently and more systematically the fund's work in emergent, non-core macro-critical areas, notably in the area of climate change and inclusive growth. So far, these areas of fund operations have received less attention from the IEO, in part because while these topics are by no means new, their coverage by the fund is relatively new. But this will change, as we said, as the IMF increasingly steers its operations more in this direction, possibly. The IEO may also usefully consider the broader questions related to the fund's institutional mandate, including by evaluating the way the fund balances attention to core and non-core activities. Second, the IEO may have to invest more in evaluating the fund's collaboration with other international partners. One challenge will be to consider how best the IEO itself can work with evaluation counterparts. We have learned from experience with the recent evaluation of collaboration with the World Bank on climate and other issues, how important it is for the IEO to work well with other evaluation offices. There is also the challenge of how to impact the fund's corporate culture, how best to encourage a shift away from the fund's culture of self-reliance and ensure the fund invests more in working with other agencies that have comparative advantage, as emphasis falls on fund non-core areas. Third, the IEO could get more involved in assessing the fund's human resource and budgetary strategy. Staff skills mix and resources will need to adapt to ensure that policy advice delivers true value added to member countries, advice that is in line with countries' needs and experience. For example, more granular advice in new areas will mean greater need for specialist skills, less jack-of-all-trades macroeconomists. Also, the IEO could evaluate the issue of whether the fund's corporate model is well adapted to responding efficiently to super crisis and play a greater role in evaluating how the fund manages enterprise risk. Pushing this broader agenda, the IEO interaction with civil society can become increasingly important in helping the IEO help the fund. There is often a wedge between civil society's concerns about inclusive growth and climate change and the fund's perception of its role and success in addressing such concerns, a wedge which could lead to growing challenges to the IMF's legitimacy. The IEO can help reduce this wedge through a closer collaboration with CSOs, both listening to concerns and helping assess how the fund responds to such concerns. For example, the IEO can help ensure that the fund's work on climate change and inclusive growth is both transparent and committed. On instruments and resources, we foresee the need for a greater use of shorter, sharper evaluations to better align timing of recommendations with fast-paced changes in fund work. This is an issue my colleague Miguel will take up in a few minutes when I finish. We also see the opportunity to build on the experience from the pandemic to make a greater use of virtual outreach and social media to leverage the IEO's own limited resources to increase awareness of our work. Importantly, the IEO itself may have to gear up its own resources, making sure that our in-house staff have the background and experience to assess the quality of fund advice on non-core issues. Let me end with a few issues for discussion on which we would like to hear your views. The main question, I guess, is how can the IEO best help the IMF be most relevant for a changing world? Some ideas I just mentioned include have the IEO focus more on evaluating non-core fund work, have the IEO provide more assessments of fund collaboration with partner agencies, working closely with other evaluation offices, and engage more than it does with civil society. Have the IEO evaluate the fund HR and budgetary strategies, as these are central to the fund's success, we believe, in dealing with upcoming challenges. And finally, have the IEO take advantage of new opportunities for virtual outreach, including through a more systematic use of social media. We recognize that each of these strategic directions has strengths and weaknesses for the IEO, and it is important to identify these well and strike the right balance between new targets, existing targets, and available resources. And your views on all this will be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much. Let me finish my presentation here and go back here. Stop sharing. Hi, Jim. Sorry, we lost you.
We can't hear you, Jim.
See me.
Can hear you now. Good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hooray, I lost connection.
You're very faint. We could hardly hear you. You may need to turn your video off.
Sound any better?
It's a little bit better, but can you say something so we can hear the volume?
Yeah, I'm testing it now.
Yeah.
That's a bit better. It's still not great. Strong.
Really great. I'm trying, I'm still trying to get my internet back up at the same time I'm doing this, but at any rate, I'm not sure how much use I can be here until I get my internet back. But I'd like to thank Nicoletta, and perhaps we should go straight to Miguel. And while Miguel is speaking, I'll see if I can get my internet working again.
Okay, no problem. Let me try sharing my presentation. Can you all see it properly?
Yes.
Okay. So my plan today was to give you some highlights of a chapter that we've been working at that compares a little bit the IEO with other evaluation offices in international financial institutions. And hopefully it will go a long way in responding this morning's question by Kalpana on how the IMF and the IEO should be approaching these issues. And we thought this chapter was a good idea because after 20 years of internally driven development, we think the anniversary is a very good opportunity to reflect not only on what we have done, but also to learn from the experience of others. And in conceptualizing this chapter, we had two framing thoughts. The first one is how heavy was the impact of the circumstances at the time of the creation of the IEO in its design. I mean, I don't know if James is listening now, but certainly he knows that 20 years ago, the IMF was not the same institution. It was a much less transparent institution. Certainly, there was no universal agreement on the need for an independent evaluation office. And once it is decided to go ahead with the IEO, they were very preoccupied by two things. The first one was the interference of the IEO in the business of the fund. And the second one was the problems that they saw in the design of other offices. They saw them as very dominated by the parent institution. They thought they were too big and they were lacking independence. And that affected a lot the design of the IEO. Maybe it's now time to get rid of some of those, some of that weight. And the second framing thought that we had is that certainly many colleagues were going to tell us, so the IMF is different. And therefore the IEO has to be different and cannot be compared with other evaluation offices. And that is certainly true. I mean, the IMF is not a development institution, but at the same time, we thought that we face many of the same challenges and the same problems that other offices face. And we thought that we have to be able to learn from others. Before I jump into the findings, let me tell you very quickly how we approached this chapter. First, we reviewed a series of reports by colleagues on two topics that the IEO had also evaluated, fragile states and the global financial crisis. And then we went and interviewed colleagues in all of those offices. By the way, for those of you in the audience, thank you very much for your help and patience. So, what did we think that the IEO is doing well? Let me highlight three areas. The first one is what we call the less is more approach. So as Charles was saying, we are the smallest among evaluation offices in large international financial institutions by any metric. But very especially, we produce fewer reports. And we think that model has served the IEO very well because by paying close attention to the absorptive capacity of the fund, not only of the reports themselves, but also of the follow-up work they generate, we have increased both the attention that the institution pays to evaluation and also the impact of our evaluations. The second area is that we enjoy high levels of independence. This goes a little bit to Roger's question this morning. For example, on topic selection, we do have a systematic consultation process, but at the end of the day, it's up to the director, it's up to Charles to choose the topics that we evaluate. So the board does not approve the topics that we evaluate and does not approve our work program. And that's a difference with most of other evaluation offices. And the third area is that we have developed light but effective mechanisms for quality control. Many of you have participated. We do 1 day long workshops in which we bring together for discussion former staff members, former management members, former EDs, external experts, officials from other organizations, from CSOs, etc. While most of our peer evaluation offices use peer reviews and advisory panels, which of course do the job, but many of our colleagues told us that they have faced problems that we haven't faced. For example, they have suffered by these processes becoming box ticking exercises, very bureaucratized, time consuming, and in general, they thought that our system was more, conducive of dynamic discussion, diversity of views, and enriching. But most importantly, let's focus on what we can learn from other offices. And the first one that I wanted to talk about is the timing of evaluations. So we found that many offices conduct early stage evaluations routinely, not only now for the analysis of the response to the pandemic, but in general. For example, all of the evaluations that we looked into in response to the global financial crisis were early stage evaluation, which is in stark contrast with our own evaluation of the global financial crisis that came up 6 years after the crisis. So Kristalina was talking about just-in-time evaluations this morning. So these early stage evaluations are pretty close to that concept. They are very useful, they are timely, they are informative, and they extract lessons from recent experience that can be almost immediately applied. They are very well received by the executive boards of those institutions in which they are conducted, not only because they are informative, but because they narrow the information asymmetry that I think Nairi was talking about this morning between the board and the staff and management of the institutions. So it's very useful for the board. And they are also very well received by management because since they focus more on the process than on outcomes, because the outcome is still developing, the accountability element of the evaluation is reduced. So they feel more comfortable. However, you know that the IEO is constrained by our non-interference clause that Charles talked about in detail this morning, so I won't get into that, but simply say that it does constrain our ability to engage in a timely way in some topics, mostly program related. What we don't think would be a good fit for the IEO are real-time evaluations. These are designed to provide immediate feedback to those planning or executing a project. Normally, they are used in the context of humanitarian interventions. For example, UNICEF does them all the time, but they are based on very fast information flows that require a specific set of tools, capacities, and processes that the IEO and the IMF do not have. And most importantly, the reason that we think real-time evaluations wouldn't be a good fit for the IMF is that we think the institution itself does not have the capacity or even the need to absorb information and adopt corrective measures in real time. In fact, as far as we know, only IED in the Asian Development Bank is among these offices conducting a real-time evaluation of the bank's response to the pandemic. A second area in which the IEO could learn is certainly methodology. We use the same bread and butter tools that all other offices use for data gathering and analysis. We do literature reviews, interviews, surveys, country cases, some statistical and econometric work, text analysis, etc. But we are lagging behind our colleagues in terms of specific evaluation methodologies. Maybe for that reason, some colleagues during interviews said that we are not really doing evaluation. We are doing research, which is pretty close to staff research. So probably we should strengthen a little bit our toolkit. And among the tools that we could incorporate to our arsenal, the most obvious one is probably theories of change that were used across the board in all the reports that we analyzed and in all the offices that we talked to. For those of you that are not familiar with the concept, they are simply a map or a log frame of how a certain intervention or a certain project is supposed to lead to an expected outcome. So they are very useful in guiding the evaluation process. But there are many other tools that we could incorporate. We could use content analysis, contribution analysis, process tracing, etc., etc., etc. There are a myriad of artificial intelligence tools now being developed. But even if they were advising, I mean, our colleagues in other evaluation offices were advising us to sharpen our methodologies, they very much warn us against the risk of methodological dominance that they have suffered, which is a problem that by which evaluations turn into a mechanical application of methodological tools. And that creates an illusion of rigor that voids reports of substantive content. So obviously here a balance is needed. The third and final area in which we found differences is on the follow-up process. As Charles mentioned before, we have a robust system for monitoring the implementation of recommendations, which is basically after the board meeting, the management has 6 months to come up with a management implementation plan that translates recommendations into actions. This management implementation plan is approved by the board, which is something that doesn't happen in other evaluation offices. And we think helps a lot ensure, an ambitious response by management and staff. And then we have every year the periodic monitoring report that in our case is done by a third party, the Office of Internal Audit, which is also different from other institutions, because in other institutions, we have seen that evaluators themselves are normally taking care of the process of monitoring the implementation of recommendations. So that makes us wonder, should we have a greater responsibility for monitoring implementation, maybe with the Office of Internal Audit or on our own? Maybe we could be providing advice to the board on policy papers prepared in response to our recommendations, or maybe we could be, assessing the costs and risks of delays in implementation, or maybe we could assess the impact of the measures that have been taken, not only following step by step, the list of actions in the MIP, but looking further into the spirit of recommendations that we made in the first place. We also wonder whether this process would also help the IEO staff relation. Maybe it would increase trust and ultimately favor an easier implementation of recommendations. And of course, since we are such a small office, a new responsibility like this one would certainly have resource implications. Let me just leave you with a few issues for discussion for the panelists and the audience in general. First one is whether the strengths and weaknesses that I spoke about are the main ones. Do you agree with them? Are there any others? Second question is how useful you think early evaluations would be for us, for the IMF. In other words, how constraining is our strictly exposed approach that we've been talking about in this session and the previous one. Third question is, which are the evaluative tools that we should be adding to our arsenal? And finally, should we have a larger role in monitoring and assessing the implementation of recommendations? Maybe yes. That's all. Thank you very much. And over to you, James.
Okay, can anybody hear me?
I can.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you, Miguel, and thank you, Nicoletta. I had a number of issues I wanted to raise, but given that you probably still can't hear me very well, I'm using my phone to connect now. I think it would be best if we go directly to our very distinguished panel of discussants, and we'll start with Harold James, whose name is familiar to all of you, I'm quite sure. A professor of history at Princeton, a very good friend of the IMF and a very good friend of mine, fellow colleague of mine at CIGI, and a very familiar presence on Project Syndicate. So, Harold, let me turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jim. It's wonderful to be with you. Thank you, Charles. Congratulations, by the way, Jim, on your new book as well. It's just a real pleasure to be here and to be able to comment on such thoughtful and provocative papers, the papers you just heard by Nicoletta and Prakash, and the one that Miguel just presented. I mean, in a sense, to answer one of Miguel's questions, you are here doing something which is very different from an ex post assessment. You're thinking of an ex ante assessment of the next 20 years of the IEO and the IMF, and so I think that's really fascinating. Nicoletta and Prakash start off with a distinction between the problems of the recent past and financial crises and their costs, and the likely new super crises of the future. And they think about a reorientation of the fund and what the IEO can do to support that process of rethinking, or as the managing director put it this morning, of learning. And what I wanted to do was very briefly to offer some thoughts that are really based, in part at least, on thinking about the very, very long-term history of the IMF and how it came about in the 1940s, the problems that it was supposed to solve then, and how they relate exactly to the problems of this world of multiple crises, super crises, or sometimes people call them polycrises. So 4 quick points. First of all, the core expertise, as Nicoletta presented it rightly, the core expertise of the fund recently, as well as some unhappy and unpleasant experiences, have been concerned with the management of financial crises. And in particular, it was discussed in the first session, assessments of debt sustainability and what governments and lenders need to do in order to ensure a return to sustainable debt. I think, unfortunately, that this kind of expertise will still be very much needed and be really central in the coming years. In the immediate future, indeed. COVID has pushed much of the world outside some big and rich industrial countries into a heightened vulnerability. Interest rates are soaring in advance of any kind of tightening in the advanced industrial countries. And I think everybody is quite well aware of these issues. And the new difficulties that arise because there are other big public lenders, China as a creditor. This is an area that's full of risk, but it's actually very much in line with, I think, the traditional mandate of the fund. But the second area that I wanted to highlight was the way in which I think correctly Nicoletta and Prakash identify environmental change, the threat to climate sustainability, as the major, increasingly difficult challenge requiring prompt action. And it's also, I think, reasonable to be very disappointed by efforts so far. And notably, we've just had the COP26 meeting in Glasgow, which I think was a disappointment. And here I wanted to draw particularly on one lesson, I think, which is very, very clear from the long past. Phenomena that are threatened will remain in the sphere of abstract discussion or nervousness concern unless they can be accurately measured. Providing data about how much something costs is essential to building a consensus about finding solutions. And that was actually key to the Bretton Woods story, because at the time of Bretton Woods, you couldn't have got the agreement that you had, and you couldn't have created these institutions without the development of national income accounting. So national income accounting, the Richard Stone or Colin Clark story, was built by industrial countries meeting the challenge of mobilizing resources for war. But today we're still very much focused on GDP. And when you think of the fund and what it does publicly, it's often about presenting GDP statistics. But that's fine for some kinds of problems, but it's not right for dealing with the biosphere. And I think there was a very, very interesting report by the UK government commissioned from a group chaired by the Cambridge economist Partha Dasgupta, just recently published, where he exactly identifies this question of the need to think differently about growth and include a measure for the depletion of natural resources in the biosphere, include a real measure of what the real wealth of nations is, rather than thinking of it simply in terms of GDP. So, that data focus, I think, is a crucial one, and it's historically interesting to think of the evolution of the fund as built on national income accounting. And if you're thinking of this new revolution, you need to think of a different kind of accounting. Third point I wanted to make briefly is that when we think of big challenges, the future, the degradation of the biosphere is only one of the issues. And a mega trend that I think is going to inevitably affect the IMF is the question of the data revolution and the application of new techniques to manage it, including artificial intelligence. The key thing there, I think, is that you need more detailed data that can apply to environmental threats, can apply to health threats. It needs to be regularly updated, ideally real time. And that, again, is a long-term historical issue. If you think of the story of the fund, one of the critical obligations in Article 8, Section 5, or the obligations of members, is that they have to supply data. And the kind of data that is going to be supplied, I think, might be a case for rethinking. And finally, and this gets to the question, I think, that was already raised in the first panel that Sean was talking about and Neri was raising in the question. We're still living in a world where security concerns, often loosely described as changing geopolitics, are dominating economic news. whether it's the debate at the western end of the Eurasian landmass about Russian gas provision and gas pricing, or the escalation of tensions around Taiwan on the eastern side of the Eurasian landmass. One of the under-recognized features of the Bretton Woods settlement was the way in which there was a deliberate parallelism between the fund and the bank on the one side and the United Nations organization on the other. The largest 5 members by quota of the Bretton Woods institutions were intended originally to be identical with the 5 permanent members of the Security Council: the United States, the Soviet Union, China, the United Kingdom, and France. And that didn't take place because of the non-ratification by the Soviet Union and then because of the Chinese Revolution. But I think today the issue of thinking about security and economics and the relation between the two of them is more urgent and looks actually close to the kind of urgency that it had in 1944 and 1945. So the IMF then, in short, should be concerned with properly accounting for the wealth of nations. It's a task for which it needs to be pushed, guided by the IEO and others to equip itself with the latest tools and analysis, but it will also have to negotiate between powerful and not necessarily aligned interests of increasingly assertive and even angry states. And information, I think, is going to be the critical instrument in diffusing anger and promoting constructive engagement. I'll leave it at that, Jim. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Harold, for raising up important points. Let me turn it next to Allison Evans, our distinguished panelist here. She had a career currently in the innovation group at the bank, having previous for the age and Chief Commissioner pays an impact. I'm sure Allison will effective discussion.
Thank you very much, Jim. I have to confess I'm struggling a little to hear you, but I think that was my cue to start. So many thanks indeed for this invitation, and many congratulations to the IEO on your 20th anniversary. And actually many thanks for 2 very stimulating presentations. It is in many ways a gift in these intensely challenging times to have the opportunity to pause and reflect a bit on where we, or rather the IEO, has come from and how it plans to face up to the future. So as Nicoletta noted in her presentation, a lot has evolved over the last 20 years, and perhaps no more so than in the last 24 months. The organizations that we between us are evaluating are under intense pressure to respond to these multiple interlocking crises, from climate to COVID to surging debt distress, rising inequalities, distress migration and resurgent conflicts. And the magnitude, I think, and systemic nature of many of these crises has overturned much of the stability of the early part of this century, shifting instead to what some have called sort of unstable conditions, where I think there's a collective soul searching about maybe some of the assumptions driving our policy and development paradigms, and asking whether these are indeed sufficient for what lies ahead. But how does this affect evaluation? I mean, evaluation, the history of evaluation, certainly of institutionally embedded evaluation, I think is rooted in the world of new public management and evidence-based policy making. And many of the tools and techniques that underpin it and the questions that drive it were actually forged during periods of relative societal stability, with notions of improvement, of doing things better, and making incremental changes to policies and programs for societal gain. But we're seeing shifts around us that maybe force us to question whether, others have put it, this incrementalism is sufficient. Crises impact the craft of policy making, assumptions about the status quo, the old normal, they all need upgrading. And so arguably, we should be thinking the same for evaluation. uncertainties are greater. There are new gaps in our understanding, new types of problems on the horizon, new players, new stakeholders and interests. I mean, it's hard not to have watched the COP26 proceedings and not concluded that something new and potentially game-changing is happening outside the room rather than in the room. Something that is challenging to all policymakers, but also to evaluators. What it's obvious is that evaluation is not and cannot be immune from the world around it. However much we protect our craft from interference, it is not something we can usefully or meaningfully abstract from context. Now, I want to be really clear that there exists a strong and enduring institutional case for the agenda of, if you like, incremental improvement. IFIs need objective evidence regarding their effectiveness. They also need public trust in the quality and integrity of their decision making, and independent evaluation can contribute to both. But we also need to ask ourselves whether it is enough. It's important that we don't get so comfortable or defensive about our craft that we persist in hitting the target, the metrics of the number of evaluations, the number of recommendations actioned and followed up, but end up missing the point. So perhaps what we need to complement our stock questions and methods that focus on what is working and what can be done better is to tackle some of the bigger questions of what can past efforts tell us about the readiness of our organizations for tackling systemic crises, how our institutions size up alternatives, how they tackle trade-offs and choices, how they're experimenting, adapting and collaborating differently. Are they using evidence and knowledge to meet these super challenges of today? And what lessons can we feed in and how quickly? So to return specifically to the two presentations, I mean, I fully agree with the thrust of both. And I certainly don't want to give the impression that the IEO is stuck on incrementalism. But I do wonder whether there may be more ambition to be found. On topics for evaluation, the point about core and non-core macrocritical areas is clearly central, and it will obviously take some time to fully work through what are the most important questions for the IEO. But it will be important not to get overly locked into focusing on the small changes and adjustments that the fund is making, but also moving up to a higher plane, assessing the fund's strategic positioning versus other actors on these big questions of climate and inclusive growth. How does the unique mandate of the fund fit together with that of others to shift the big outcomes that we're looking for? Not just a focus, if you like, on the merit and worth of the fund's work, but on its broader significance or its transformative impact in these non-core areas. These are challenging questions and definitely challenging evaluations to undertake. I'll be the first to admit that at times I'm very uncomfortable with evaluations at 30,000 feet. They require resources, methods, innovative approaches, and can be a challenge to socialize with management. But their value comes from shifting the focus on the conversation from marginal nudges and improvements to the consideration of alternative paths and new directions. The pace of change also leads me to agree entirely that shorter, sharper, swifter evaluations are needed in larger numbers. We have to accept that the accountability that we strive to contribute to is not only built on a scorecard of past efforts, but on the ability of institutions to demonstrate learning and adaptation to new and changing conditions. Shorter and sharper assessments are therefore not just about accessibility and digestibility, but a way of supporting this larger learning culture and a way of focusing on increasingly time-critical questions that our internal and our external stakeholders have about our institutions and the quality of the response from our institutions. Using shorter evaluations more intentionally to drive a focus on how the fund is learning, adjusting and adapting to these super crisis conditions might be a particularly fruitful avenue for the IEU going forward. Finally, on Nicoletta's presentation, I couldn't agree more with the need to systematically assess collaborative behavior as an essential feature of IFIs in navigating these turbulent times. I think testing the alignment between the kind of rhetoric and the reality of coordination and collaboration is actually an absolutely critical evaluation topic. But I also have this uneasy sense that we may need to upgrade our approach to evaluation around collaboration in future years. Well, I don't think it's possible in the very short term to expect our offices to down tools and find entirely new ways of working jointly. The more we can align with some of the big questions as evaluation functions across the IFI system around shared topics, the more perhaps we can start to build a picture of how our organizations are committed to collaborative working or not, and where the risks and the gaps might lie. I suspect we may need to be thinking about this more ambitiously in the years to come. A few final thoughts on Miguel's presentation. I love the small is beautiful argument. And I fully appreciate many of the downsides and risks to scale in independent evaluation functions. Some obvious ones are evaluation fatigue and an institution that becomes, if you like, wired for scrutiny. But I also wonder there may be some downsides to less is more. Questions not yet formulated in the minds of board members, issues not yet on the radar of management, stones not overturned on a regular basis. While I fully accept that there's a matter of proportionality, and the World Bank Group that I work on is a very, very different animal to the fund, I still wonder whether the virtues of small size can be slightly overstated. And I do think that sometimes cries of limited absorptive capacity are a wonderful way of keeping evaluation out of your hair. And actually, small size can indeed constrain the development of that broader evaluation and learning culture, and also limit attention to some of the high-level questions that are not otherwise asked by the institution itself. I agree on early stage evaluations. I think we are going to have to dip our toe even further into this pond. I do think early stage evaluations can robustly test questions about relevance and quality of evidence being used to design and derive early implementation of programs. If you like, asking the question of whether the institution is doing the right things as opposed to only focusing on is it doing them right. But I think it's essential that we commit to following up these early stage evaluations with full-blown ex post evaluations down the line to close and complete the evaluation cycle. And on real-time evaluations, I completely agree. This is not something that I think we're well suited in our institutional settings for carrying out. On methods, bread and butter tools are critical, but the investment in methodologies is important as the world around us evolves. It's not a question of letting the methods lead. It's very much recognizing that as the problems get more complex and more systemic, that we need a range of upgraded methods to tackle those in a systematic and robust way. There is a much larger data landscape out there now. There are many techniques for how we can engage with that, from qualitative data analysis through a whole range of AI techniques. And I do think it's really important that we continue to upgrade ourselves methodologically without, as you say, risking over-determining the approach via new methods. You mentioned box ticking. This sounds a reasonable risk, but I'm not entirely sure what it relates to, but it definitely sounds undesirable and not a good direction of travel to go in. Finally, on the theory of change, this can be done well or it cannot be done well. And it can also be very challenging, I think, in institutional contexts where there is not the commensurate commitment to thinking along the lines of theory of change on the side of operational staff or management. We certainly use theory of change a lot, as you know, in IEG. We use it differently in different evaluations, sometimes to scope, sometimes to test program logic, sometimes to point how interventions and system issues connect and assumptions that are made about those connections. A well-used theory of change can help us identify not only where the program logic is, but also what's missing assumptions undeclared, dependencies not noticed, and above all, implicit or explicit mechanisms that are essential to drive change. So I would indeed encourage you in that direction, but I would also apply the caution that theory of change can be difficult to explain unless you have counterparts on the other side who really do understand it and are committed to its use. So to finish up, coming full circle, I very much agree with the presentations and have gone a little bit out of my own comfort zone to raise the bar a little. I want to be clear that IEG is by no means practicing all that I preach here. We are also on a journey, but the bottom line is that we cannot insulate ourselves from the world around us. We need to be constantly thinking ahead, and I think this exercise today is a great example of that. So finally, borrowing from Eric Hobsbawm, and thank you to Oscar, my colleague, for giving me this quote. He said, famously said, as a historian, I am very concerned about the future. And I think as evaluators and evaluation functions, we too, despite our obligation to comb the past, should always be very concerned about the future. Thank you very much indeed. Back to you, Jim.
Okay, now, is everybody able to hear me at this point? Yes, great, okay. No thanks to Comcast. I did manage to get my internet connection working again, finally. So I have a few words to say at the end, but let me first quite happily turn this floor over to John Hicklin, who's a longtime colleague at the IMF, former deputy director of the IEO, and now has a new perspective as a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development. So John will give us his very broad perspective from his wide experience. John, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jim. I hope you can hear me. And thank you very much to Nicoletta, Prakash, and Miguel and Roxana for the very helpful and thoughtful presentations. I fully agree with many of the themes there, and I'm obviously going to have to be very selective in the time allotted here. So absence of mentioning specific issues doesn't mean to say that I haven't thought about them or agree with many of them. I'll be selective. I have three suggestions on how the IEO might help the IMF over the next decade and learn from others, which also I think includes a word of advice on the direction not to go. The first is to urgently evaluate the IMF's role in facing climate change and reduced biodiversity. The second is don't forget the basics, dig deeper on the vital issue of the IMF's effectiveness in its program, surveillance and capacity development work. And the third is to look at this issue of strengthening the IEO's independence and lines of accountability. This would help both its evaluation work and the follow-up monitoring and implementation. But the presentations nicely bring out several tensions which the IEO has struggled with since its inception, and that certainly need to be re-examined as it looks forward. The tension between ex-post nature of the model of evaluation and the desire, despite that, to be relevant to urgent policy discussions. The tension in avoiding being too mechanical in pursuing evaluation techniques, while also avoiding the temptation to act more as an alternative research or policy department. And the tension between the need to understand the IMF by being close to it and all its idiosyncrasies, and on the other, to be sufficiently distant and independent, has always been emphasized by the external evaluators, NIRI included, in order to be effective and credible. So it's not surprising that the IEO model differs from its comparators. They work in different contexts, have different histories, and face different challenges. And it's very helpful to be aware of the comparisons in order to make judgments on any desirable recalibrations for the IEO. So the IMF and its members face enormous challenges in the decades ahead. There are many more than the one I'm going to focus on, which is climate change and associated reduced biodiversity. I've given my views elsewhere on how the IMF, I think itself, must change quite dramatically to think not just what it can do within its existing mandate, but even maybe think whether it needs to change it. But the very different nature of the challenge the IMF faces requires that the IEO also change its approach. Why? Because in this case, the ex-post model of evaluation is inadequate to meet the challenge. That long-standing approach is fine when the learning function and the IEO role in helping the board's oversight of management can be handled in the context of essentially repeated games. Lessons learned ex post from one set of programs or periods of surveillance can be applied in future, and the IMF's performance over time can be hopefully improved. This model manifestly doesn't work in the context of such a massive shock that is both prospective and unique, in the sense that failure to avert it will be irreversible and extremely costly. An ex post evaluation in 5 or 10 years' time on whether the IMF did all that it should have done to meet its obligations over this critical decade will have limited use. The chance will have gone. So how can the IEO better help the IMF on this issue? There are several aspects, not in my view, as people have mentioned, by real-time evaluations or audit work in real time, that one can understand why these techniques are used in other institutions in the context of big capital projects, or when there is no internal review and self-evaluation as they exist within the IMF. Rather, I would suggest the IEO think innovatively about the topics for evaluation, as well as their timeliness and methodology. The IEO director's informed but unimpeded choice of topics and methods is a great strength and distinguishes it from other evaluation officers. I give a couple of examples to illustrate what I mean, but this is in addition to some of the other suggestions that are made, including on experimenting more with short form midterm evaluations, though I have qualifications on that route too. But my first suggestion here is on that the IMF should evaluate the IMF's assessment of the risks that climate change poses for the IMF's ability to fulfill its purpose. Whether the world deals with these issues, or as seems more likely now, it fails to do so. Such an exercise would not only look at the existing risk assessment model, but use other metrics and institutional experience. What would best practice suggest? How would this be fitted within the existing mandate? And how would it need to change, if at all? What are the risks to the IMF's effectiveness in not adapting its policies, and by implication increasing the resources and skill mix it devotes to its work? In the past, the IMF has made major adjustments, which we all know, and implicit in that was an assessment of risk that some big changes were needed to avoid worse outcomes. Another innovative and urgent topic would be an evaluation of the IMF's relations with UN agencies dealing with climate change and reduced biodiversity, where the analysis could point to gaps in the system of responsibilities of international cooperation required to deal with such global threats. I'm not sure about joint evaluations with other agencies, but certainly much closer contacts are warranted. So the second major point that I mentioned, the second message, is don't forget the basics, and I think this has come out in other comments. But do dig deeper on the vital issue of the IMF's effectiveness in its program, surveillance and capacity development work. I could confidently predict over the next decade that the IMF will once again face crises, not just about policy stances and external shocks, but underreporting of the levels and complexities of debt, and questions will be raised then about what more could the IMF have done. More generally, there's the long-standing issue of limited traction with advanced and large emerging economies, the stigma of coming to the IMF when needed, and the more recent absence of in-person visits that must have affected the IMF's interactions with its members. So evaluation of the IMF's basic work could examine more deeply why it is less than fully effective in some cases. And in this area, I think the focus in Miguel and Oksana's paper that it picks up from others on looking more at the evaluation techniques that the IEO should use should be examined further. You need to look in the question of why, what is behind the significant failures time after time. Is there sufficient acknowledgement of that the authorities themselves have not carried out agreed policies, why this has been the case, and what the implications for that are for the IMF in moving forward? A lack of clarity of what the IMF's role is and its metric for success, unfunded mandates to do work and skepticism within the staff as a result, mismatches in skills and so on. And I think this is the way of getting at some of the issues which Nicoletta and Prakash mentioned in terms of getting to human resource and resource issues. My third point, which I'll be very quick on, is to look back at the ways in which the IMO's independence and lines of accountability could be strengthened. And I would urge here a message which I think others have given, but it is an evaluation and not an advisor role, except as lessons emerge from evaluation work. In practical terms, what does this mean? Don't fall into the trap of being seen as being an alternative policy or research department, arguing the case for revised policies and procedures, only having those that are based on evaluation evidence. It will become less effective if it goes that route. It must find a way of being constructive by always presenting the data based on evaluation evidence. On the non-interference clause, a lot of people have spoken about this. I think the main determinant of whether the IEO can push back on attempts to delay legitimate examination of recent programs lies not, I think, as Sean said, in having a clear-cut definition, but in gaining credibility and support for sound judgments. For this, as with many other issues, it requires building and nurturing broad support from the membership for a sensible interpretation in particular cases. This in turn requires not being too close to staff and ex-staff and management, incorporating the views of authorities and civil society in all evaluations, including with new techniques to do so in short format ones. One of the shortcomings, I think, of the shorter form in recent times, the authorities' views weren't incorporated. And maintaining very strong external links to bring outside views and underrepresented views to the IMF's attention, a major issue which Nairi referred to this morning. Finally, on monitoring the implementation, OIA now, the Office of Internal Audit, has a role which it didn't previously have. And I wonder whether the route is not going with the IEO having more role in this aspect, but in giving more specific line responsibility of the OIA to go to the board on this particular reporting issue rather than to management. That would free up the IEO to concentrate on focusing on subsequent evaluations. In all its commentary, in its use, it should be very cautious in non-committal in saying whether or not new policies or procedures of the board are in fact consistent with evaluations that have come out. And from previous experience, I'm very glad that in the 2007-8 episode, when we were under enormous pressure to give our view on the surveillance policy debate, we abstained from doing so, and I think that was a very wise decision. I'll leave it at that. There are many other issues that have come up, but I think the time is now for others.
Okay, John, thank you very much. And we're running out of time here, and I haven't really had a chance to weigh in because of my own computer problems here. But let me just try to wrap up this session by making a couple of very general points. The first point I would make is that the IMF, like any institution, is constantly facing trade-offs. There's never going to be an ideal answer to any controversial subject that comes before the fund. And one way that this manifests itself is between a desire to set up general policies that can then be applied even-handedly across all the membership, and this need to try to tailor each individual situation to the circumstances of that country. And I think a major function going forward for the IEO could be to try to assess whether the IMF is handling that kind of trade-off in a wise way. Specifically, this came up in a very major and important way with the handling of the Greek program in 2010, when the fund had set up policies to say we weren't going to approve any program of this kind unless we could be assured that there was debt sustainability at the end. And the very first time that it was faced with the question of whether to approve such a program was for Greece in 2010. And I think there's been a very widespread view that the IMF dropped the ball on that occasion. And it's a very difficult thing for the IEO as both an internal and an independent evaluator to assess that. But I think going forward, that kind of situation is almost certainly going to arise again, and it should be a function of the IEO to evaluate. The second issue where this comes up is with mission creep. I mean, mission creep is essential if the IMF is going to continue to maintain its role as an important solver of problems, because the world becomes increasingly complex over time, and the IMF has to be able to respond to that. So the point that Nicoletta made, I think, about how these lines between the fund's core mandate and the fund's responsibilities, these lines become increasingly blurred, is one that's going to become increasingly problematic over time. And I think if the IEO can explicitly deal with the issue of mission creep, why that's essential, but why it's also necessary to keep it under control through recognizing its core mandate, through further collaboration with partners, trying to get other partners to collaborate, is going to be critically important. And finally, if we look back on why the IEO exists in the first place, the IEO exists in the first place because the IMF became increasingly important and prominent in global finance through the 1980s and the 1990s, and that brought it into addition through just increasingly controversial positions, to the point where by the end of the 1990s, the IMF had to do internal self-assessments by recognizing that there were things that it had not done very well. It took a long time to resolve the Latin American debt crisis. There were lots of controversies that came up in the Asian crisis. These crises were continuing despite the best efforts of the IMF. And so there was a lot of internal self-assessment that had to be done at the same time that the reputation of the IMF was becoming increasingly trashed in public discussions, to the point where, for those of us who were around in the late 1990s, at the annual meetings in 1999, the local authorities in Washington had to set up essentially an armed camp around the IMF and the World Bank. There were high fences that separated this enlarged campus, blocks around the IMF and the World Bank, that you could only enter with ID badges for the meetings, and so it was a situation where protests were taking place. There were violent clashes between the DC police and protesters and so on. And all of that contributed to the establishment of the IEO in 2001, but it also contributed to the kind of introspection at the fund that led to major changes. New rules for engagement with lenders, or with borrowers rather, the so-called new conditionality guidelines, which were designed to give greater say to borrowing countries in how their programs should be designed. And so this whole question of local ownership of programs, local ownership of policy design in countries, is something that the IMF paid a lot of attention to, instituted major changes to try to deal with it. And I don't think that even now, 20 years later, we really understand fully to what extent the IMF has carried through on the promises it made to do that, because establishing local ownership of program design is a very difficult problem. And it has been taken to heart in some cases, less taken to heart in other cases. And I think going forward, the IEO is going to have a major responsibility to try to deal with this whole question of how well the IMF has succeeded in establishing local ownership of program design. It's one of the really crucial issues. So I think those are the issues that I see as really being crucial going forward. I hope we've shed some light on that in this morning's session, and maybe given some food to thought to the people who will be taking the lead tomorrow, starting with Nairi's keynote address that we all very much look forward to. So if Charles is still there, I will turn it back over to Charles to wrap things up and lay the groundwork for tomorrow's sessions.
Thanks so much, Jim. I'm glad we found your voice. It was a really interesting set of remarks right at the end there. So it's been a really great day, very rich discussion. I've been busily taking notes. In fact, I'd like to see a transcript because I know there was much more content and substance in what was said than I was able to absorb in the first go round. And tomorrow we will continue. And those of you who had questions, issues, comments they wanted to make should have an opportunity in the final session to come back. Tomorrow we have two sessions, one at 10:30 with Nairi Woods. Will give a keynote remarks, given her long experience on the IEO and perspective on global economic governance issues. And then we'll have a wrap-up discussion with some of our key stakeholders in the final session. So that starts tomorrow at 10:30, and we hope to see you all then. And until then, goodbye. Bye.